the topic itself sounds awfully academic, but as I kind of revealed my notes, I'll read it, there's nothing much here. So the talk itself will not be that academic. It will be more of a riff on a couple of themes that relate to the book of operational images. And the original invite, and this is also why a big thanks to Caja Negra for making this talk and a talk tomorrow in Barcelona happen, together with, obviously you here, is that it's sort of a book talk. It's sort of a book talk that sort of picks up on the recent translation of operational images. And of course, up on the slide is also a hat tip battle booth, even if I'm not talking about that particular book, but in terms of really the labor of people translating books should never be forgotten. So in that sense, it's just a nice give a couple of hat tips to many directions as such. I'll do a short talk. That, as said, will riff on particular themes of operational images. I'll try to explain and probably convince, I don't know if I can convince, but I will try to convince of why I found it interesting, and perhaps you will find it interesting as a concept. And this is the punchline as well, that it is a concept. It is not necessarily a description of a particular type of images. It might be, but I'm handling it as a concept, as a methodology in that sense, as a way of grasping media histories, as well as contemporary forms of digital aesthetics. In other words, it becomes a tool to connect different timelines and time scales, different materialities, to help us understand the weird ways in which technical images nowadays are not necessarily visual. They do not even necessarily look like images in the traditional sense, but they have other characteristics that speak to infrastructure, architecture, multitude of other spatial dispositions, as well as questions of data. And I know that a lot of this will resonate with Iris's work, and we've been also in dialogue for a long time with Iris about multitude of projects where our interests really overlap. So it's super nice to see these. I mean, I'm looking forward to yours. I'm not looking forward to mine. I'm looking forward to your contribution a bit later. It would be wrong not to start with Harun Farocki when we're talking about operational images. So consider the talk as a slow slide into my punchline that I already revealed, that operational images are a concept. And the reason why I'm interested in concepts is because they do things. It's a concept catered by Farocki about 20 years ago, but links with Farocki's work since at least 1980s, his film works, so-called documentary works, and the ways in which he worked with images across his different roles, from TV industry, from making of documentaries, to really like being an image professional in that really intriguing sense that you see in all of his works, whether it's the installation works or whether it's the film works as such. Farocki is one of those filmmakers who's really good in giving us generative concepts, and operational images is of course one of those as well, that ever since the past 20 years has been with us in relation to a lot of questions of digital aesthetics and technical images. Many artists use it with brief mentions. Many academics use it with brief mentions, where it's usually used the definition given by Farocki that it's primarily images that operate, might not represent anything, that they are almost tautologically about operations that they might enact, or the ways in which they imply operations in bigger technical systems, for instance. And I was intrigued by picking up exactly the question of operations as a driver for this particular question of images. Diving into Farocki's work and writings gives you also other kinds of coordinates that help us to understand basically the stakes of why operational images was a meaningful term for him as such, and why it has become a meaningful term for so many others as well, again, from Trevor Packlin to Tito Style to many, many others as well. Some of it relates to his interest in the long-term industrialization of vision as part of that he reads as this sort of Enlightenment way of rationalization and optimization of practices of vision, which also implies the gradual shift of vision being an animal capacity, human animals and other animals' capacity, into machine vision and computer vision as particular forms of sensing that not necessarily anymore have anything to do with vision in the traditional sense. I don't think they do, actually. They're not vision in any kind of way as such. They're forms of sensing for sure, but to speak of vision is more like a skeuomorphism, sort of relating to things that we find useful to understand it, but it's not. And it implies this bigger point that is made obvious by a couple of years of people engaging very intensively with questions of artificial intelligence, or as I like to call it, computation. I think it's artificial intelligence is just a fancy word for computing, and it will be discarded quite hopefully soon. Very advanced forms of computing and interesting forms of computing, but they imply also this question of cognition, not as replacement, but as particular infrastructures of cognition that also handle things like decision-making on behalf of humans or instead of humans. So think of it as large-scale infrastructural cognitive systems, in the sense that cognition is not anyway about consciousness, it's about forms of processing, decision-making, that obviously for humans especially have a particular affective, embodied nature, but it does for machines as well. They are embodiments, they're not just human embodiments. So I want to say that Farocki was really good in showing the stakes of it, but never really giving us a full coordinate system of how to treat operational images. So my project that I'll talk about, and the book, and the ways in which I find it useful, is a really nice interface itself to diving into all kinds of nice research from Farocki's own history, from people who work with Farocki, but also much beyond Farocki. My book is not about Farocki, by the way, which might not be clear, especially because I spent the past 7 minutes talking about Farocki. But it's a good starting point. Like, for instance, with long-term collaborator Antti Eeman and Kodjo Eshun's sort of engagement with the notion of operational images in one of the books that they edited as well. Even the sort of a short definition that they give, it's very fulsome in giving a scope of the ways in which operational images expands into typology of all kinds of subsets of images, including data images, including statistical images, which sort of already alludes to that really extremely gray history of graphs and indeed diagrams, and the ways in which these become forms of not just images, a point that I try to elaborate in the book. In other words, I speak about unimages or non-images in the book as the necessary replacement for the thing that we called for a long time in human history as images. In other words, the ways in which it builds this sort of a paradoxical nature into it as well. I mean, this would be a long debate with every one of you who is into diagrams and architects, whether diagrams are images. It's a fun debate. I've tried it several times. The other one is really fun as well. That one that is sort of put into Farocki's mouth by Kodjo and Antti as well. The unspoken rules of filmmaking. Those of you who know Farocki's work, it's basically catering to a documentary style of showing what kinds of operational situations show operational images. For instance, in the military-industrial complex and such. So it's basically speaks to number 9. If there is a new regime of images in the world, never forget to show it. So you can see that basically this is an unfolding of almost methodologically of Farocki's way of engaging this new type of images, even if I refrain to call it a type. But the other stuff is super fun as well. My favorite is the one that if you show somebody making a meal, always show him cleaning the dishes afterwards. It's questions of labor. Many of the other ones as well really are like 11 points of things that Farocki found dear in terms of his political and filmmaking, labor, automation, as well as hatred of Arvo Pärt's Fratres as a musical score and such things. Now, my entry route was through a project that we had in Prague for 5 years, where Abelardo was also involved, where the first time I was working in a photography department. So with people in that team who were mostly photography scholars, the fundamental sort of a starting point was, what does operational image mean in the context of photography? Digital imaging, but also as a vehicle to deep dive into other alternative forms of photographic imaging that do not necessarily reproduce themselves as images. What would photography be that doesn't look like images in the photographic sense? We had with Abelardo a couple of answers that we'll talk about later as well. And in general, it could be said to be a mapping of the others of photography as such, including, like today, we had a small chat with some people in a seminar, photogrammetry as a particular early form of thinking about images in those registers, that we also packed into a couple of publications, including photography of the scale, where the notion of scale was the thing that drove us to think about what is photography outside the usual scale of a photographic frame, a topic of interest to many visual studies scholars as such. Now, I'll talk a bit about Abelardo and my work a bit later as well, but this is like the framing of why I think that operational images is a concept and a method instead of a typology. It might be the first one as well, but I think that it's also generative to see it itself as an operation that helps us to understand different scales of working with images, or the ways in which it relates to different disciplinary practices, from visual culture to architecture to all kinds of other forms of computational design, for instance, as such. There's at least 3 levels that are sort of nicely implied in the concept of operational images: historical, conceptual, and aesthetic. Even if the aesthetic doesn't necessarily mean anything to do with art, but I'll explain what. Now, operations implies a history of operations research that emerges as a particular kind of a rationalization agenda and becomes a particular management agenda since 1960s. First, during World War II, it's one term used for all kinds of scientific methods employed in analyzing data gathered from battlefields as part of all kinds of military operations, as part of a logistical optimization that then becomes gradually, after World War II, in the Cold War period, institutionalized much beyond warfare. Indeed in management strategies, and indeed in all kinds of versions that become really a backbone for a lot of Cold War things, including linear programming and the ways in which logistical thinking itself harks back to certain kinds of scientification of methods that are adopted from those contexts as such. I'm fascinated with those histories, even if the book itself doesn't really go deep dive into it as well, but it would be the sort of a really super interesting exchange between new forms of education about data visualization, roughly around 1960s onwards, in relation to new technologies of vision, in relation to particular architectural discourses that are built into certain institutions like MIT and the Center for Advanced Visualization, at the back of Bauhaus, in relation to the Cold War stack that is happening in the US, the ways in which particular forms of inventories and data management become central to people like Buckminster Fuller and others thinking. So you could see that it starts to build this sort of a really interesting mix of creative, technological, or even technocratic creativity, like my colleague Ryan Bishop calls it in his book on Cold War art and technology as such. This kind of stuff is super fascinating. It doesn't really feature in Farocki's story, but it's implied there as a backbone of what is operations in the 20th century, leading up to more recent digital computing, but already much before that. But I'm also interested in the question of what is operational imaging beyond computing. In other words, in terms of early histories of photography, like photogrammetry, as a form of measurement of the world, or even earlier forms of non-photographic, non-technical imaging, or perhaps it is technical, including drawing. including such drawing practices as well as mathematical practices like projective geometry as well. This is why I was fascinated with this, almost like a studio brief to myself or a prompt of whether maps are a form of instrumental imaging or operative imaging, including these kinds of planetary media around early 18th century. So around, 200-300 years earlier, of thinking about planetarity in relation to geodesic measurement and projection methods and the ways in which those start to build a particular measurement of Earth's surface, with the implication that they also trying to measure the true shape of Earth. These kinds of expeditions and scientific measurements, we can call them also very colonial forms of knowledge, really framed those seemingly apolitical questions about shape of the Earth. But of course, they were at the back of trying to understand navigation, cartographic questions so that they can facilitate navigational forms of movement across planetary surface, right? So French expeditions, British expeditions, including establishment of measurement standards. Not in this expedition, these are from 1730s, from one geodesic experiment, but the other ones, for instance, the ones that tried to measure the true length of the meter and established the standard and then was a standard for a long while as such. So you can see that the stakes of those early cartographic forms of knowledge production were planetary, of a scale that is very localized but imply the planet, and they're basically forms of datafication in relation to the vector data of maps, but also in terms of building measurement standards upon which worlds were supposed to be built. All kinds of colonial projects indeed were built based on that. The other bit is the conceptual or theoretical. Well, it's all conceptual, but it's theoretical as well. Past years of humanities theory has been really populated with notions of operations or analysis of operations in different keys and different registers. I'm not going to go through this all. It's more like this is the thing that I do in the book. But I try to also connect all kinds of strands of media theory with these questions, including Masumi's work, but also Karen Barad and others as well, to establish a sort of an interesting dialogue in those terms. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to a couple of things that might be of more of interest. Now, the aesthetic register is really interesting. It really is about aesthetics in the sense of production of sensible reality and sensing of reality as such. At the back of most of the uses of operational images, it's often read slightly reductively into the military-industrial complex, because the most often used example was the semi-automatic cruise missile systems that Farocki was mentioning and was the backbone since early First Gulf War of early 1990s, followed up by all kinds of other forms of smart precision weaponry that ever since have been with us with catastrophic consequences. But I was as fascinated with the non-military forms of sensing that established, again, questions of scale in really interesting ways. One would be the questions of Earth observation that date back to roughly 60s and 70s, so to speak, as part of orbital technologies that both look at Earth surfaces as sense data for various reasons, not just surveillance, but also for all kinds of architectural and environmental reasons, as well as towards the other parts of the universe, in other words, cosmic sensing, including those kinds of sensorial technologies like in the images here from different decades. The one on the right is from 1976, I think, of Viking Mars landing as such. Production of the sort of architectural machinery sent on different planets as part of this comparative planetology of sensing that I see as part of operational image stacks. There's a really fun undercurrent here as well. So again, Farocki. So there's a really fun little text of Farocki's called Phantom Images, right? where he starts with this really familiar scene from history of cinema, history of film, of so-called phantom shots, right? Shots that are impossible for the human perspective, like being under the train or in some kind of a weird position. But the cinema camera was, of course, embracing those impossible views that Farocki then calls phantom shots because they're not humanly possible. He goes on to mention that animation does the same as well, and that's why animation is fascinating. You know, think of early 20th century animation already as well. The possibilities of what you can do with a line is not about human embodiment. It's about, you know, in Paul Klee's terms, it's a line going, you know, wild. So the range of phantom shots populates the imaginary of operational images much beyond computation as such. And I was fascinated about all kinds of these shots and images and forms of sensing. They're literally off the planet in terms of possibilities of inhabiting Mars' surface, but also that they imply the other regime of sensing that is not about visible light. It is about all other forms of radio spectrometric sensing. One of the lines I use in the book is the following. It's a cheap one, but I think it's pretty good. Most of human history, for reasons of our physiology and evolution, we're more or less focused on a super narrow spectrum of visible light. We're humans after all, and most of our art and culture has been focused on that, but perhaps the radical task for the next couple of thousand years is to come up with a vocabulary and, of course, artistic methods of addressing everything else beyond the visible spectrum of light. In other words, other forms of radiation, other forms of invisible or invisual, you know, radiation indeed, infrared, ultraviolet, and such. And as such, that sort of seems to be just like a cheap post-human dream, but actually it's at the back of really crucial questions of environmental sensing, questions of how to model non-human life on more than human life, as well as all kinds of really interesting aesthetic and artistic questions, right? Including, of course, beyond, you know, this kind of, I mean, any kind of electromagnetic radiation as such. So, which is the reason why me and Abelardo, we've been fascinated by a number of forms of sensing in our joint work as well, including in this book, Living Surfaces. I'll put the other slide back in a second, that sort of expanded on the ways in which usually operational images has been thought. For years, Abelardo has been working on topics that relates to plans and questions of technical sensing in and through and of plans as well, which led us also to write the book together that has as its target to focus on these long histories of sensing as well as architectures of plans as surfaces. One of the easy ways to understand this is this sort of like a constant dilemma that I have, also really relevant for my current work that I'm not going to talk about today, is all kinds of technical forms of false color imaging at the back of multispectral sensing that again is familiar to a lot of people in landscape architecture, probably in architecture as well as those of you who work with other kinds of technical imaging. Again, it sort of shows on a very mundane level where the stakes of this seemingly post-human pipe dream of looking at other spectrum than visible light is really crucial in terms of infrared, in terms of all kinds of other spectra that you might use to sense of what plant health and so forth as such. And this, of course, implies the questions that, you know, infrastructure that Iris will talk about later as such. I won't talk about this, but it's just, again, you know, hat tip to Abelardo and our work together, and Maria Andrés Olmedo, who did the sound work for Lumi. Hopefully we'll get another chance and some other context to see Lumi, which is basically sort of a meditation on questions of not just visible light, but light that has to do with, you know, planetary heating, melting surfaces and such. I'll skip that because I want to talk about a couple of other things. I'm just checking where we are with slides. Of course, they're in completely wrong order. Art methods as well. I would have wanted to talk a bit more about a couple of other projects. Some of this is very obvious as well. the ways in which contemporary forms of operational operates itself often is found in all kinds of game aesthetics, and I would go as far as saying that it's much more about game engines and the ways in which infrastructures of thinking about this are really embedded in contemporary aesthetics, such as Lawrence Legg's work. Lawrence's work is worthwhile to mention, among many other good ones, because Lawrence is somebody who's also very consciously used the notion of operational images in his thinking about all of this work. One of my favorites over the past years is Ora Satz's work, who is a sound artist in London, whose preemptive listening, I don't know if it's been screened in Madrid yet, but should be, is a really great way of responding to a prompt that Ora asked me several years ago when I was starting to do the book. Ora's question to me was, do you think that there's a sonic equivalent to operational images? I was like, perhaps. And then she does this amazing film that wins awards as such. At the back of her head was already the idea that sirens, as a particular soundscapes of preemption, of danger, of interruption, of marking out zones by way of sonic soundscapes, does the work of operative imaging by way of sounds. She also worked with various sound artists in the film, so it's warmly recommended for those of you who are, and I get this question all the time when I talk about this, is like, what is the sort of a non-visual in terms of sound or audio? I think Ora's work is really good one response to that as such as well. There would be a lot more to talk about, but I'm mindful of time. But I'm just putting it up there as well, including Rosa Menkman's Impossible Images that I speak about in the book. I'll talk about a couple of slides before finishing. I've got like 3 minutes, so we'll do that. And then we'll have time at the end as well. So much of my talk, which is mostly a rambling of notes, but I'm sharing among friends, was gearing up to this point that instead of thinking about operational images as typology of digital imaging or automation or the ways in which computers have changed questions of imaging, it is indeed a concept, and as such, it should be used as well. I've been interested in, with my academic hat on, the idea that how do artists, but also, of course, academics, use concepts in their work? What is the manner in which we think of concepts as not representational, but as ways of operating and handling different materials or different scales of the world? Really great concepts do that, right? They speak of scales that you would not necessarily otherwise be able to handle. They might go beyond what you think of experiential because they speak of abstractions, but they pull abstractions back into embodiment. Concepts, when they really work, they like interfaces. They pull together different scales and they make them rub in a really nice way. That's why operational images is a really wonderful concept in my mind, because it pulls different scales of imaging, of different scales of sensing into a particular way of understanding what it might do in relation to questions of visuality and data, for instance, as such. That's why I fell in love during the project with concepts like invisual, that itself seems to be a substitute of invisibility, but it's got that nice sort of a touch. In English it works well inside it as well. It's got the inclusive partitive of, the preposition of in visuality, and yet it is a negation of it as well. So in other words, it's almost like a term that captures visuality inside it, but eats it, and the metabolism of the concept spits it out as something not visual, right? And it relates to all those forms of radiation, material sensing, or something like that, that is not just visual, right? As such, it's a great paradox to think with that I find super intriguing, and I constantly pose it to artists. What would be the in-visual art school? What would be the sort of a in-visual visual studio, and so forth? I'm finishing soon, but I want to share this as well. The other one that is really central to the underpinnings of this is the idea of operations other than war, that is basically the rereading of Farocki's legacy beyond the military-industrial complex. The short version is easy. It's environmental sensing, it's scientific sensing, it's other modalities of sensing that then also build different trajectories for understanding operational images. But it's not war either. The ways in which forms of environmental sensing are embedded in contemporary warfare, including technical warfare, are ways of also this unfortunate inclusion of those regimes, not least in Gaza and many other places of genocidal war operations. There's something beautiful in the quote that I use in the book. I had to go back so that I get it really accurately. Primus Sumi, the philosopher, talks about the non-battle, which I kind of used as a prompt to myself as well. If operational imaging is often seen as real-time imaging and sensing of battlefields, what would be the stretched out waiting aspect of the non-battle, both in the military sense, but also as experiential sense? In other words, what is the form of not having a battle, but preparing the conditions in which you can, make it favorable for whether it's military or other purposes? In other words, Masumi really beautifully builds in the questions of preemption, planning, but also this sort of conditioning that I find really interesting from the point of view of spatial planning and such. There's something really capturing nicely in that question. Some of these I try, and I'm finishing now, some of these I try to also, in dialogues with architecture and architecture theorists, we've been trying to think of these as would these scale in relation to questions of spatial planning, spatial design, and architectural discourses as well. What is the relation of architectural theory? Would there be an architectural equivalent of operational images? Again, Farocki's films are one kind of response to that. If you start looking at them as particular architectures in which operational images function. And I'm sort of still on that trajectory as well of what they do for the sense of different scales of space. And we can talk about that later. And I think Iris's talk will be one response, so that's why I don't want to take more of the time here. The last thing is this. The sort of a response that I started giving as well is that operational images is itself a meta concept that travels. In other words, it's a concept that has, over the past 20 years or so, started to travel between disciplinary boundaries. And the ways in which the responses to that reform the concept is really interesting. From architectural studios onto art schools, onto media studies curriculum, it sort of becomes itself this binding force that might have very different meanings and very different kinds of concepts. Like, for instance, in this context where I'm in dialogue with the literal software tools of architecture and people who use them as ways of also understanding the other scales that operational images builds into it as well. So it really is itself a particular vector that becomes one form of a transdisciplinary method. I'll finish there, but let's do a really nice Q&A at the end, but that's after Iris's thing. Thanks very much for your attention.